Welcome to this week's Outsiders Inside the Lords report. I'm leaning on Emmeline Pankhurst, which you might wonder why. It's a nod to the controversy over Maggie Hamling's rather ludicrous statue of Mary Wollstonecraft, which has caused such a controversy. And the thing about Mary's legacy is that she is one of the most important public intellectuals for humanity. She happened to be a woman, and it's right she had a statue. And they've done a ridiculous, silly statue, which has caused huge controversy, and I don't blame people for saying it. But one interesting thing is the justification that the sculptress has made is that this is not really a statue of Wollstonecraft at all. It's every woman. It represents all women naked. But the thing is that is part of the problem of identity politics. It actually wipes out the individual contribution of a great thinker and philosopher who should be credited in her own right, not as every woman at all. So that's as an aside. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the processes in the House of Lords today. One thing is I've told you on several occasions about questions that get asked, and I wanted to draw attention to the fact that sometimes those questions are very important. So yesterday there was a question to Her Majesty's government about the impact of new coronavirus regulations on the ability of terminally ill adults to travel abroad for assisted death. I was glad that question was put forward. I applied to speak, I didn't get it. I'm delighted that Gisela Stewart was taken as a speaker on it. This is so important because it represents to me everything that's wrong with the government's tone-deaf approach to humane responses to COVID and lockdowns. They made an exception to allow people to travel for assisted suicide, which lots of people have said is very fair of them, but you are not allowed to travel to visit your relatives in a care home who are dying to hold their hands because there's no provision for that. These are the kind of things which makes you just think they do not understand at all the kind of debates and discussions that people are having around the kitchen table about how they just don't get what's going on. But that was a serious debate, and I was glad that it was tabled. The sort of debates that you do have to sit through is there was a question yesterday asking the government when they plan to publish their revised waste prevention programme for England. This went on and on and on. Ooh. And obviously I'm not very keen on the whole issue of waste prevention, but one thing to note was that Lord Goldsmith of Richmond Park, otherwise a failed Tory politician who didn't get elected, he was elevated to Lords, now representing DEFRA, zoomed in his replies as the Minister, which I thought was atrocious, because I think he should have been there in person. And also they spent a huge amount of time having to explain how the increase in plastic waste caused by the fact that people are wearing face masks and there's a lot of plastic about was actually an exception, and it just made me laugh at the way that they kind of wiggled around on that. But it also, again, felt very detached from the kind of discussions that are going on in the real world. In a debate prior to that on dental services, which is important, let's be honest, it's just not one I know much about, one of the speakers I was very impressed with, and then I'd recognised her, and then I realised it was Baroness Bull. It's Deborah Bull, the ballet dancer, who I adore. I had a moment of kind of fangirl, oh my God. Anyway, the thing about the House of Lords is all sorts of people pop up that you've known and you didn't even know were in the House of Lords, and there they are. And so that was just an interesting one. Obviously, these questions are in a way an aside to the main business of the House. And the main business of the House is to act as a revising chamber for legislation that's brought in the House of Commons. And this week has really epitomised what is problematic about House of Lords as a democratic body, because the big issue that everyone was discussing was the Internal Markets Bill, which is passed by a huge majority in the House of Commons and has been sent over to the House of Lords. They refused to pass it on a second reading. It went back to committee stage, and there's a contentious part because this is all to do with Brexit, obviously. Anything to do with Brexit and the House of Lords, immediately, red flags go up. And the part 5, which is alleged to be about breaking international law, was a huge debate on Monday, which I participated in. The thing, and it felt important, but whereas there's one thing arguing for a revising chamber, and I do think even if you have a revising chamber, they should be elected. I don't think the House of Lords should be appointed, even though I am one of them. I get the irony. they weren't acting as a revising chamber. They were acting as a block on a parliamentary decision. So the contributions from the floor were very much about, we've got to block this at any opportunity, we've got to make sure this doesn't go through, we've got to push our remit further than we would normally push it, because this is far too important. The House of Commons are making a mistake, we're going to stop this happening, we're going to delay it and stop it. I mean, this is an affront to democracy. So the irony is that they were arguing that this internal markets bill was an attack on democracy. They were saying it gave too much power to the executive. Arguably, it does have a problem with that. And yet they were actually overbearingly saying they were going to block it. Largely, it was like the regathering of the Remain alliance, and it was utterly frustrating to have to listen to being lectured by these people who haven't really accepted the vote in truth and are just trying to scupper things again. But there were Brexiteers who sided with them. Why was that? And I think it's important to note that, senior Brexiteers, because they were acting as though they were lawyers. In fact, it felt like a convention of lawyers, and it felt to me as though the House of Lords considers itself to be above and beyond anyone else. They're like legal brains who come and look at issues. I spoke at length. I did not sound like a legal brain, because I'm not one, and I tried to remind people of the democratic nature of what had happened in relation to voting to leave the EU, and why this bill was trying to honour a promise made to the electorate by Boris Johnson. And I was just shocked that so few people even mentioned the voters. I mean, it's one thing being anti-democratic. You think that at least in a virtue signalling way nod at their existence, but no, this was, we understand far more. Just finally on that point, everybody wanted to congratulate President-elect Biden and accepted that he was President-elect, which broadly speaking I do too. But they were almost suggesting, well, now life has gone back to normal. All the international trade agreements will be restored. We've got rid of that horrible, nasty Mr. Trump. He's, confined. We can now have the kind of global order of rules-based international relations. And actually, I thought, again, that showed a pomposity and a smugness and an arrogance that misunderstood that President Trump, such as he is for now, may well have been defeated, but millions of people rejected that kind of global order. Millions of people voted for Trump more than voted for him the last time. And so to just dismiss it as though you could just restore the status quo and feel very comfortable that you knew where you were with Biden, it struck me as being an unpleasant reflection of their lack of connectedness with mass politics. Finally, just to say that this week has been a bit like Freshers' Fair for the Lords. So they've been doing online training courses, and a bit like online everything, it's all a bit hopeless. You kind of just feel like you're just sitting in, it's not the same as if you were in the room, basically. But one thing was very inspiring, and that was that we had an online introduction to the Lord's Library, and it made me realise just how privileged I am to have access to the most incredible research facilities, any book I want. I mean, this is just like, I've dreamt of things like this. I mean, maybe that's because I'm the director of the Academy of Ideas, and I think that's the most important thing you can have access to, books and research and so on. But it did strike me as just a wonderful access that I will have, which I will try and make public as much of the information as possible. But on the online question, I have to now do my terrible mea culpa, which is, you will have noticed that despite the great heroics of my democratic speech in the House of Lords on the Internal Markets Bill, I managed to vote against the government and vote against the Internal Markets Bill. And you might wonder how the hell that happened. This has caused me to be trending on Twitter all day yesterday. And just to explain, a variety of people have chosen to explain that that's because all Brexiteers are thick and stupid, and I in particular am a dumbass, and so on and so forth. There's an element of truth to that. Anyone who works with me in the office will know that my facility to deal with technology is not great. But actually, there's a serious point here, if I may say, which is that all of the voting in the House of Lords now is happening via a voting app, rather than the traditional walk down different lobbies. And guess what? If I'd have been walking down with a load of Lib Dems and Remainers down one corridor, I'd have noticed I was in the wrong line. But when you've got a voting app, and the voting app says content or not content, the way the House of Lords works is that the House of Lords is predominantly an anti-government, anti-Tory body. If you add up the Liberal Democrats, the Labour Party, the crossbenchers, who are largely anti the government in many instances, the Tories are outflanked every time. So they might, they just don't dominate the House of Lords. So largely the rule is, if you're voting to support the government, you vote not content because you're voting against the majority. And that's what I did. But in this instance, there was an exception. As somebody said to me in the House of Lords yesterday, 95% of the time you would have been right to have done that. You weren't the other night. And so I voted the wrong way. One good thing about the European Parliament, if you vote the wrong way, you can go and change it on the record. That's the only good thing about the European Parliament, but nonetheless you can. So I went and asked the clerks of the House of Lords if I could change my vote. And they obviously looked at me in a withering disdain and said, no, of course you can't, which was obviously... But I raised it in one of my training courses yesterday, and they conceded that the voting app has caused a huge amount of problems. Nobody can work out quite what to do. It works at the level that you press it and you vote, but it doesn't really help explain what side you would be on. And I was very grateful to Baroness Varzi, who I don't know, who admitted on Twitter that she'd voted the wrong way in the other direction, and so we'd cancelled each other out. It was very gracious of her to have kind of fessed up to that. Obviously there wasn't a pile-on against her, because largely mine was all about the fact that I'm a Brexiteer. Okay, that's talk about a learning curve. I've learned a lot this week. I hope that I'm going to be able to put in written questions, which is a new thing for me, ably assisted by Elizabeth Sanderman, who's working with me, who's done a lot of research. I'm going to put in written questions on several important issues, I think, for next week, and I'll tell you about that. And each week I learn something new. The fact that I learn how awful I am at voting on an app this week is just one of those things. But anyway, full report next week.